This episode is brought to you by Maplytics by Inogic. Maplytics is a market-leading certified for Microsoft Dynamics 365 geoanalytical mapping app. Maplytics empowers users with powerful map visualization and routing capabilities within Dynamics CRM to drive better sales, improve business processes, and engage the right customers at the right time. Maplytics now works with Dynamics 365 version 9 and the app for mobile and tablet. Inogic is a leading Microsoft Gold Dynamics CRM ISV delivering best-in-class Dynamics 365 solutions as well as cost-effective and high-quality programming services. We thank Maplytics by Inogic for sponsoring the CRM Audio Podcast Network. Welcome back to CRM Audio. I'm Joel Lindstrom, and I'm here with my co-host Sean Tabor.
Hello, Joel.
And we are also joined by two special guests, MVP Jerry Weinstock and Stephen Siciliano, the program director for Power Automate.
Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. So for those of you who aren't in Ignite, you might be saying, what is this Power Automate thing? Stephen, you wanna tell us what Power Automate is?
Absolutely. So Power Automate, in one sense, is just a new name for what we've all come to know and love as Microsoft Flow.
Okay.
So we've decided that, hey, now is the perfect time to make it be a real part of the Power family. So you have Power Apps, Power BI, and now Power Virtual Agents as well. So having Power Automate sit alongside that, we wanted to really take the existing Microsoft Flow product and make it part of the family.
So is Power Virtual Agent considered its own thing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Okay.
it's now the fourth component of the Power Platform. So if you
Nice.
see updated slides, they now have those four things just going right across of Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents.
That's very cool.
And what was the thought process behind the branding change?
Yeah. So part of it was we had a desire to really show these things all working together as part of the Power Platform. But there was another thing that really drove this change, which is why Power Automate is a bit more than what Microsoft Flow was in the past. And that's the introduction of the robotic process automation capabilities to Power Automate. So with robotic process automation, you can now build automation that uses the user interface of applications to be able to automate them. So you can write data to them, read data from them, simulate mouse clicks and interactions with those applications, because there's a bunch of apps out there that don't have any APIs that we can connect to. Even with custom connectors, you have to have some sort of REST API to be able to work with something. So our goal with the new UI Flows capability is to really open the door to anything that you can do on your PC, you can now automate with Power Automate. So that was kind of the longer explanation for where Automate came from, because we thought that just talking about flow and workflow didn't really encompass the full vision and set of capabilities that we wanted to talk about with all the new things that we're bringing in.
So with RPA, can you do? Is it the thought process that in customer service, for example, with USD, you legacy apps in their own little windows? Is the concept now you could use RPA to pull that data in more real time, where you wouldn't have to have that legacy screen displayed?
So the way that RPA works is it does directly interact with the UI. So it has to be displayed somewhere. There's actually two types of RPA that we often talk about. One is what's called attended RPA. So that means somebody logs in. I mean, on our laptops, we could do this right now, or at your desktop at home, and you literally have the UI in front of you, and you hit a button, and it'll go and read some data from that. So if you have some customer service apps up, it will actually pull the data from those. So that is very similar to the way that people have worked with these customer service apps in the past, where there's literally a person there doing it. The other type of RPA is called unattended. And what unattended means is it runs somewhere else without a human having to interact with it directly. And the best place to run that is in a VM in Azure, but of course you could run it wherever you want. And the idea there is you have to make sure that whatever you're doing in this automation doesn't require any human interaction at all. Like, all it can do is run the UI flow to interact with everything. So that includes things like login, getting users credentials, making sure all the applications are started, and really robust error handling, because a dialog could pop up unexpectedly, being able to handle all of that. So that unattended automation, though, the benefit there is it doesn't have to take up a person's screen, doesn't have to take up their time, and you can scale it out. So you could have 100 VMs running the same UI flow in Azure, and that allows you to be able to highly parallelize the tasks as you want to do.
Nice.
So those are kind of the two flavors of RPA that would.
My impression when I saw the demo the first time was, wow. So we've got 300, several hundred connectors here. This is like, okay, now let's connect to everything else.
Right.
That's exactly right. I mean, what we find is the connectors today are really great because they abstract away a lot of what you have to do. And for the connectors that we have, because it's API based, it's really reliable and it just works.
Sure.
But there's still a ton of systems out there that don't have any way to connect to them. And even for systems that do have APIs, so take Excel, for example. Excel has a relatively rich API surface, but still there's just such a deep amount of functionality that's in the Excel client that there's still a lot of things you can't do by just calling Excel APIs that you literally have to use the full rich desktop client to be able to do.
Right.
So what we found is there's a lot of use cases for just doing whatever a person can do, right? Just do that same thing, and as long as they can do it in a way that's scriptable and repeatable, we can call that from Power Automate and get something done, really easily. So
how are you managing performance? Specifically, you're kind of at the mercy of the performance of the system that you're building UI flows to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when you record a UI flow, it actually records basically everything you do, including the delays that you wait for things to pop up and for jobs to complete. So you can go in and you can tweak that after the fact. So you can adjust the amount of time that a given step will take. But if something, say you have it, save a file, and saving the file sometimes takes 3 times longer than other times. We do also have built-in retries. So if the next dialog hasn't popped up yet, we will, continue retrying to look for that control for some period of time until it does finally pop up. But it will eventually time out. So you do have to make sure that as you build your UI flows, you're testing them out across, a couple different maybe file sizes or data types or whatever it is that you're going through, and make sure that it does work. So that way, when it does hit that thing that takes a lot longer, the retry policy can still catch it. Otherwise, you may be left with something that ultimately times out and fails.
With extending from the RPA concept, is there going to be a concept of an RPA custom connector, or is it just straight RPA, either unattended or attended?
So today we support basically 2 types of applications, but there's no kind of custom application extensibility yet. So today basically we use 2 different technologies that you can choose between. One is for Windows applications. We use the UI automation framework that's included with more modern versions of Windows. That's the same framework that all of the accessibility features in Windows use. So as long as an application supports the UI accessibility APIs, or the UI automation APIs, then we can automate it. For web applications, we use a framework called Selenium, which is a very common web automation framework. So as long as your web app is scriptable via Selenium, that works as well. Now, there are some applications that don't really work very well with the Windows accessibility APIs or aren't web-based. So for those applications today, we don't do a very good job with UI flows of handling them. So if you go out and build a UI flow today, you may notice that when you hover over an application, say it's some old Java-based application, you actually will get a warning that'll pop up that says, hey, this application isn't supported yet. So what we're going to be doing over the coming months is we're going to add more application types that we can support. And someday, even having a custom connector equivalent where I can have my own custom application type is something we've certainly thought about. We don't have any specific plans for that, but really with the built-in Windows APIs and the browser Selenium framework, we think that's going to cover, the vast majority of applications out there, and we'll close out a few of the remaining gaps. And one of the other things that we're also looking at is leveraging computer vision to be able to use applications even if there's no APIs at all for the application. So that's, if you think about how, like the MS Paint canvas works, like there's no, it's not like every pixel on that canvas has an API to index, so you always have to be able to fall back to some strategies that, just look directly at the pixels on the screen.
Right. Because with Power Virtual Agent and with RPA, I immediately started thinking, okay, I can have a Power Virtual Agent that goes for like healthcare. Okay, I have someone come in that says they want information on their eligibility, but the eligibility system is a HIPAA compliant external system outside of Dynamics, so I could use RPA to go get the data and bring it into my bot. That kind of concept is super exciting because it really opens a lot of doors in terms of how you can interact with the customer without having to jump through all the HIPAA hoops, if you will. You know what I mean? But was that kind of part and parcel of the concept behind RPA? Given those kind of capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the idea of being able to integrate with these legacy systems, be it in whatever industry, whatever vertical, where it takes time to modernize them, that's definitely where we see a lot of RPA usage. So beyond healthcare, finance is another example where there's lots of regulations and those applications can be around for a very long time. So having some way to interact with those applications because we haven't been able to build APIs for whatever reason, be it compliance or time or money, that's where RPA becomes really valuable.
And this will help a lot of on-premise folks as well.
Yes, that's definitely right. So the Power Automate service runs in the cloud, but with the on-premises data gateway, which is something we've actually had for, I don't know, like 5 years, you can connect to anything that's running on-premises. And the actual UI flow itself does execute locally on the machine. So theoretically, if you have a very long-running UI flow, if you pull out the Ethernet cord in the middle and then plug it in before it finishes, it will actually just work. We don't really have a full kind of offline support yet where I could queue things up, send them down the machine, and replay them later. But that's another one of the things that we're actually looking at in the future is how do we do something like that?
I also see a lot of possibilities in field service as well, like being able to pull telemetrics from offline systems. After you, because we have technicians that go underground and they're offline.
Yep.
Then they come back online, then they can go and grab and update that other system with the data they collected in Dynamics, which is really cool. Do we see the ability to execute RPAs from mobile devices as well, or does that matter?
So if by mobile devices you mean Windows tablets, certainly.
Okay.
With regards to, if you're talking about Android or iOS, it's not something that we're thinking about in the immediate term. I would say especially on iOS, there's a lot more restrictions on what you can do in terms of being able to monitor other apps and interact with other applications. So it isn't something we've actually taken a hard look at yet. I think we want to get the current Windows experience out there and really reliable and polished and get that GA'd before we start trying to tackle some of those other things.
So I got some questions from some of the other MVPs. I guess one question is, what do we call what we're building now? When I watched the keynote, when Charles was talking about it, he still called it the things you're building flows or workflows. And then I look at the side, I see it automated workflows. What do you call it, or what do you say? I mean, we still say we're building flows?
Absolutely. So the flow is kind of like the parent class, I would say. It's the base for everything. So everything that you build when you go to Power Automate is a flow. Well, not everything. You can also build entities and custom connectors and solutions and those other types of things. But really the core thing is a flow. And then there are different types of flows that we support. So we have the business process flows, which come from Dynamics.
Right.
We have UI flows, which are the new thing, and then we also have what we call automated flows, which are the flows that have been around as a part of the Microsoft Flow product since the beginning. So those are kind of the different types of flows that we have, but they're all you use Power Automate to create a flow or a set of flows.
Right. What does this mean for logic apps? Because now we've got functionality in Power Automate that's not in Logic Apps. So up to now, it's been a subset of the functionality running in the same pipeline and everything. Now we've got these new types. Are you going to bring those back together?
Not exactly. So even before the announcements this week, we had functionality and features that were in Microsoft Flow that were not in Logic Apps. So like business process flows is a good example. Like all the business process flows capabilities and building on CDS and solutions, like none of that existed inside of Logic Apps. So we are going to, in Power Automate, continue to invest in additional types of flows, UI flows, business process flows that aren't just the baseline Logic App equivalent, which is what the automated flows are. So for features that come to the automated flows piece, that will, of course, that's running the same engine as Logic Apps will continue to be there. But as we invest more in business process flows and UI flows, those are additional kind of abstractions that build on top of that layer, so that won't necessarily be something that's brought back into the Logic Apps core code base.
Okay. And another question was about synchronous flows. Because with CDS and Dynamics, we have asynchronous background processes and synchronous real-time workflows. We've been pretty much able to replace almost all of our background processes with Flow now that we have the ability to call actions and things like that. But the one remaining gap, the biggest remaining gap, is the real-time synchronous processes.
Yep.
What's the plan for synchronous Power Automate flows?
So I'll take it in it's a bit of a journey. So the first thing that we've been doing is we've been investing a lot in bringing functionality that used to be unique to synchronous workflows into automated flows. So things like being able to configure the impersonation used to be something you had to do in a synchronous pipeline. You determining whether or not it runs as the calling user or the owner. So you can actually do that with automated flows. Being able to execute a series of actions as a single transaction. With the change set feature that just rolled out, you can actually do that from a automated workflow as well. So we're bringing these features that used to be unique to synchronous workflows into automated flows. So that way, automated flows can really be the vast majority of scenarios, even including scenarios that previously were only possible synchronously. Now, that being said, there still will be some scenarios, no doubt, that have to run inside of the pipeline for CDS. So we are looking at what we can do to bring some of the existing flow functionality into that pipeline to bring these things closer together. But the fact of the matter is, today at least, there are some scenarios that you can do asynchronous that you can't yet do with with
things
modern
like
flows.
data validation. You can't save the record until this is true.
Yep.
Those types of things are where you pretty much have to use real-time workflows for that.
That's right.
We have a couple of questions about the Office connectors. One is some of the products like Excel, competitive products like Zapier have richer functionality. Like one example, I haven't done this myself, but the example is given is running a flow and a row is added to Excel. You can do that with Zapier, but the person who asked the question said you can't do that with Flow right now.
So Excel is interesting because Excel does not actually have stable row identifiers for each row inside Excel. Because it's as much as we add things like tables and stuff, it's really just kind of an open canvas. You can just drop whatever you want anywhere. So we actually did at one point in time have serious consideration about adding triggers specific to Excel, but what we found is that they were fragile enough that we didn't want people depending on them the way that they were built. So what you can do with Excel is you can create a scheduled flow that looks at columns to determine whether or not something is new. So you could say, if I have a column that I know I'm going to update with a timestamp of when that row has been added, or it has some other unique key, you can actually build those things into the flow and do that. But it does require you to think a little bit more about how exactly your spreadsheet is being updated, because it can definitely break if you just kind of assume that anybody who has access to that spreadsheet, if they just add a row, if they
Right.
right-click at the top of the table and insert it at the top, will that work the same way as if you put it at the bottom, or if you remove table format? There's all types of things that can go wrong there. So generally, we do offer the same building blocks. So in terms of being able to query Excel and look at tables and do all of those things. So it's really just how do you use those building blocks to build the automation that you need.
Right. And another Office question was, many Office connectors, more Office connectors is his request, so you don't have to use HTTP connector to play with the Graph API.
So we are definitely investing more into the Office connectors and adding more features there. One of the big things we're actually doing is we are open sourcing a lot of the connectors, so that way anybody can contribute additional actions that may be missing inside of Power Automate. So we've already open sourced a number of the connectors, and if you go to the repository, you can just add whatever actions you want, rather than waiting for somebody at Microsoft to be able to do it.
Okay, great. Some questions on the documentation. One, just generally, a lot of the connector documentation looks like it was generated by a machine rather than a person. And the example I'll use is, we have the Common Data Service connector, we have the Common Data Service Current Environment connector, and there's key differences in how things like lookup fields work, for example. But a lot of users stumbled over that because it wasn't clearly called out in the documentation. So what's your plans for, so like, for example, if I go to Microsoft Docs, there's very good examples for a lot of the development tools and Common Data Service and Dynamics and Power Apps with actual examples. Is there a plan to get there with at least the primary first-party connectors?
Absolutely. So we definitely, particularly with CDS, plan to significantly enhance the documentation there, along the lines of you described, with more concrete examples. I think we're a little bit in a middle ground right now, because we're kind of finishing up all of those parity items. So we wanted to get kind of everything done before we went and did all the examples, because the way some of those things will work will change once we finish. So we're basically finishing that up around now, and once that gets done, we'll go through and have a lot richer sets of examples that will be more comprehensive.
What's the plan with the Common Data Service connector? Are we going to always have two different versions, or are we going to get to one CDS connector to rule them all?
So always is a very long time, so I can't commit to that specifically. But for the near term at least, we will definitely have the native experience, which is the current environment connector that will automatically pick up the environment and user context from wherever that flow is deployed. And then we will also have what internally we kind of call the external connector, which allows you to connect to a different tenant or a different organization from Flow. But really, it's about, what is the scenario that you're building? Are you treating CDS as the place where the data for your process is going, or is CDS just an external database like SQL or SharePoint or whatever it is it may be? So that distinction has a lot of implications in terms of how the systems actually talk to each other, because the native connector literally is logic apps talking directly to CDS. There's nothing in between at the runtime. Whereas the connector layer provides an intermediary, and that's important because that connection from the logic apps runtime to CDS inherits the security context of that logic app when it's set up by that creator of that flow. If I'm talking to a different tenant, that same security context doesn't flow through. So it actually has to use our connector infrastructure where all of those tokens are stored for OAuth. So it actually uses a completely different infrastructure approach, depending on whether or not it's that native connection or an external connection. So for the time being, at least, we will have these two different approaches.
But it seems like all the new stuff goes into the current environment connector.
That's correct.
The associate records, the child processes, all that. So it's getting to the point, being able to use fetch XML, run on multiple triggers at the same time. So it's getting to the point where that's the only one I want to use. And I guess having the same icon for both of them, even I will occasionally pick the wrong one and then have to go back and oh no, I need to use your current environment. So can you at least give them different icons or something?
That we definitely are doing.
Okay.
We have a ongoing discussion with our design team to get us some very different icons for those two, and maybe even different colors.
How long do you keep the Dynamics 365 deprecated connector still there?
So I don't know exactly what the plan is to remove it. I think we announced the deprecation in April, so it's been about 6 months. For reference, we had there was an old Excel connector that we actually deprecated about a year ago, and that we're finally removing. So I'd say within the next 6 months, it'll likely be removed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I still see a lot of, especially our newer team members, write flows. They immediately go to that because they think I'm doing a Dynamics flow. I need to use the Dynamics connector.
Yep.
They see the icon, it's shiny. That's what they want. Yeah.
And one more question from the list along the lines of documentation, which is the ability to call actions is fantastic. I'm using it for my presentation later this week where we're calling the merge records action from a Power App, which is really good. But the experience was kind of a little bit rocky. The documentation around how to use them and the fields that you put the parameters in it's not really clear what you use. There was a lot of trial and error involved. So are there plans to improve that documentation too?
Yeah, we're definitely going to improve that as well.
Okay, great.
With actions, staying on that topic, are we improving that capability in terms of Power Virtual Agent?
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So right now, if you call an action in Power Virtual Agent, it pretty much is only an HTTPS call, right? Are we going to be able to expand that to where it's more than just an HTTPS call?
So inside of Power Virtual Agents, when you invoke a flow, that's just a regular HTTPS call. What we're actually doing right now is we're adding a tailored trigger for Power Virtual Agents. So when you create the flow, it'll actually have a Power Virtual Agents trigger that you can get a nicer experience in terms of associating those two things and defining inputs and outputs.
Yeah, because what I've been finding is with those when an HTTPS request is received trigger, it's hit or miss on the time frame in which that flow displays in the action menu. Right? It could be 10 minutes. It could be 2 days. I've had mixed results.
Yeah, it shouldn't take 2 days for that to show up.
Yeah.
So if you are seeing that, maybe shoot me a mail and we can take a look.
All right. Very good.
So I have a one thing, and this has been a challenge traditionally with Dynamics processes and business rules and other things. Kind of when you have multiple flows that you want to make sure run in a certain order, I just want to run a scenario by you. So have a scenario where when a case is created, it sends a notification to certain people, and also when a note is added to the case, it sends a notification, like either a Teams message or an email, some kind of notification. Challenge I see is that so when somebody does both at the same time, it's hit or miss which one comes first. So what I've done traditionally, I'm asking you, am I doing the right thing here? I put a delay in the one I want to run second of 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and that usually gets it. But do you have any recommendations for if we have related flows that aren't like child processes and you want to make sure that this one always happens before that one?
It's a challenge. So I would say the way that flow is designed is to be kind of highly decoupled and scalable.
Okay.
So generally we recommend against things like having shared locks on the same resource. So if I have a flow that triggers on field 1 and a flow that triggers on field 2, and if both are triggered, by the general assumption is that if there's two separate flows, they should be able to run independent of each other.
Okay.
The other approach is you could create a single flow that triggers on either of those fields, and then inside the flow, when you build a sequence of actions, those are guaranteed to execute in order.
Okay.
So you can first send out the notification for one and then the notification for the other. And you could have, for example, a condition that says, if I'm listening for either field being changed, first have the condition that checks to see if the first field was changed, then send out the notification. Then check to see if it's the other field that was changed, and then send out that notification.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be another way to kind of construct that process. But as it stands today, when you do have two complete independent flows, there really are no easy ways to make sure that one executes before or after the other, short of starting to look at timestamps on records and seeing how recently something else was updated by it. And yeah, that's
another question, and this is just something I've heard from people in the community as kind of a best practice, is to limit nested conditions where possible, not just with flow, but just general design pattern. And I think the thinking is, and I've painted myself into a corner where I have, if this is true, do this or do that, but if it's no, do this or do this or that, and you get 4 levels deep, and pretty soon you're in this Gordian knot you can't untie. When you build flows,
yep.
or you make, what do you tell people?
So when I build flows, I mean, having lots of nested conditions, I think, is a little bit of a fact of life. Like I can definitely end up with flows with many levels of nestedness.
And you're scrolling over.
Yes, but there are reasonable boundaries to what even I am willing to put up with, and that's where child workflows are really important.
Okay.
So today now we have the built-in child workflow action that just works even inside solutions, but we've always had the ability to just call to another flow with HTTP. So I would always use that extensively to really encapsulate my logic and have a single flow that does a single task. And if between 3 child workflows, each child workflow has 4 conditions, that would be insane to try to put into a single flow. But across 3 different workflows it's kind of like building an API, right? You're building a function that you can call. So you have a clean contract for inputs and outputs, and you can understand exactly what's going on. So that's what I always do when I'm building more complex processes, is I have those child workflows as a way to encapsulate logic.
And the other part about the child processes to me is it's the reusability of steps. And, so we don't yet have email templates, but this takes a step closer, because I could have a flow that has the action of sending the email or text message or whatever that is called by multiple processes. So it's a step closer to that.
Absolutely.
Agreed. With looking forward, like every year we come to Ignite, there's always big things announced, and we come the next year and it's like, man, we just got all these things, now there's even more stuff. Looking forward, how are you seeing Power Automate tie deeper into the other components of the Power family?
So it's definitely something we're continuing to invest in. We have now a 4th component of the Power family, but we already actually have really close connection between virtual agents and Power Automate. So virtual agents came from I don't even remember the name, Dynamics 365 Customer Service Virtual Agents, or whatever, Enterprise Edition Pro.
Catchy name.
But that even then, that leverages flows as the way to reach out to things. So we already have that good connection, and there's definitely things we can do to better improve between Power Apps and Power Automate. That type of thing can get a lot better. Getting from Power BI to Power Automate, where we've been making some investments in the Power BI connector, for example, in Power Automate, and we're continuing to really focus there as well. I mean, ultimately, our goal is that anybody in an organization who wants to be able to build these business solutions should be able to seamlessly transition across all of these tools. And not everybody is going to have a need for a bot and a dashboard and an automation and an app. But there are going to be people who want 2 of those 4 or 3 of those 4, and there will be some who even want all 4.
Right.
And when you do, you should be able to have a consistent, seamless experience that really spans across all of those places. So that's definitely an area that we're continuing to invest in. I think it's going to be a long-running investment. Every year you're going to see more improvements there, and we'll continue investing there.
Very cool.
What's the strategy for the templates going forward? I will. A lot of us learned flow from the templates. You had a problem, you search for a template, you find one that's close, you figure out how they did it. It seems like sometimes the technology moves faster than the templates, and some of the templates use still. I think there's still some that use the Dynamics connector, but now we're going into RPA. And can you build a template for RPA, or since it's dependent on the systems you use, or what are your thoughts about templates going forward?
Templates are definitely a challenge to keep up to date. I mean, you can imagine we have thousands of templates, so every time that a connector has an update or has a change, we have to go through and make sure those templates are always using the latest practices, and it is hard to keep up because we are making so many investments and so many changes over time. Specifically with UI flows, we don't have a mechanism today to create templates for UI flows. Because just as you called out, it's highly dependent on the system that it's running on. So we are looking at ways to how can we make the UI flows a bit more generic and robust, so that way they could, run reliably across many different system configurations. But that's something that is going to take us a little while to actually get through.
Okay, and there are some differences in behavior between the CDS connectors I referenced before. And the big thing that we didn't talk about is solutions, and being able to include solution-based flows. To call actions, you have to use the current environment connector, which has to be used in a solution today. And then you've got things, for example, calling a flow from a Canvas app can't use solution-based flows today.
Actually, today it can.
Today it can?
Yeah.
It couldn't last week, but it can today?
Yes, that's correct. So,
awesome.
You'll see some blog posts going out this week talking about some of these improvements. But
we broke news today.
There you go.
Anything else will be announced?
No, I think the child workflows, that one we actually haven't done the blog post on yet. That news will be coming out this week, but everybody really knows about that by now already. But yeah, so I mean, we've been making a lot of improvements, particularly in the solutioning and the CDS space, to get those things working, a lot more seamlessly than they have in the past. But that's one of the big investments that we made in the, over the previous 6 months to get these things into a really healthy state. So
what do you recommend? Because you've got this interesting community that is split between people who are more in the Dynamics enterprise realm, and then the people who came from Office and SharePoint and other things like that. And we're used to the solutions; they're not. So, what would you say? Is Microsoft's best practice for everybody that uses in like an enterprise solution using Power Automate to move to using solutions now?
Yes.
Or
definitely.
Okay.
Solutions are like a lot of the stuff that we have inside of the platform. They have heritage through Dynamics, but they're really generally useful as an important platform concept. Solutions are the only way to set up CI/CD reliably.
Okay.
And if you're a SharePoint developer, CI/CD can be just as important as if you're a Dynamics developer.
Okay.
So we recommend solutions for everybody, and the caveats of the solution-aware Canvas apps versus solution-aware flows, and those not talking, we're closing those gaps as quickly as we can, so that way there's no reason to not use solutions. And really anything that's beyond personal productivity should be built in a solution from day one. Every flow that I build now always starts in a solution. Even if I think I'm only going to use it for myself, maybe I want to be able to export that later and share that with other people. And maybe I want to have two flows. I want to use that child flow and I want them to export together. All of that only works in solutions.
Right.
So yeah, that's
and if you're
definitely
closing the gaps that didn't work, like the Canvas apps calling flows and other things like that, that removes a lot of the objections to using solutions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that makes me very happy because I'm very anal retentive about solutions. And in the new experience, I had to not be that way, and it was driving me crazy. So now I'm glad I can be back to being just as persnickety as I was before.
So put all your flows in a solution.
Exactly.
Yep.
Jerry Weinstock, You have recently contributed a white paper to an official Microsoft white paper. What's your white paper about?
Well, it's about Microsoft Flow, building enterprise-ready flows. It's really based upon my experience in seeing classic workflows in the customer engagement area for years, that people built flows that ended up failing and not working and just kept running and running and running into failure mode. So this paper outlines a strategy for effectively creating flows that are reliable, that run efficiently, and perform the intended function. It's not a paper on tips and tricks and workarounds and things of that nature. Basically, it's for people that are working in the enterprise that are building flows that are business critical, that need to run as expected, reliably, and with a minimal of maintenance.
Yeah, and this is important. And Stephen, I know a lot of the community examples are cool but don't scale really well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're things that are great if you want to do something once a day, but something running high volume, it would probably blow up.
Sometimes. I mean, it depends a lot on what you're trying to do. I mean, to Jerry's point, there's a lot of business critical workflows out there that aren't necessarily high volume, but are high value.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So, and for those business critical workflows at enterprise level, it's reliability is really the most important thing, and making sure that this doesn't fail. So a lot of the strategies that Jerry lays out in the white paper are really important to that. You know, things like what accounts you choose to use, how you build error handling into your processes, how you make sure that they're generic. Those types of things are applicable to the business critical thing that runs once a quarter, or to the thing that runs 100 times an hour.
Yeah. So Jerry, what are some of the things you see, or the mistakes you see people make in the way they design their flows and processes that you need to change to be what you would consider enterprise ready?
Sure. So the biggest thing I see is that people generally only plan for the happy path. Okay. That things go right, and no one's planning on, oh, I'm grabbing a file and it's supposed to have an email address in the field and value, and it doesn't. What do I do? Now, one of the challenges is Flow doesn't handle null values very nicely. So you need to have a escape valve. You need something like the configure run after to trap that error and move on and do something else potentially. Now, there's a variety of alternatives, but essentially, it's all about saying, okay, what can go wrong, and how am I accounting for that in my flow, so they just don't fail, because the warning notifications are not in your face, and you set these flows up to run to move data from one location to another, or to send alerts or do other important business functions that the users expect. And if it doesn't happen, the alarms don't necessarily go off right away. So you have to think about all the different possibilities and deal with them effectively.
How about your testing strategy? Because one of the things with enterprise is you got to test it, and your data is never as clean as you think it is.
Oh, absolutely. So that's really one of the areas that Flow really is wonderful, because there's a variety of different ways that you can do testing. One of the nice things about it is that you don't have to necessarily recreate your test record every time. You can do a resubmit. You can test again. There's a feature with Office 365 that'll just grab the last piece of information that came in there. So if we contrast that from the area that three of us have come from here, in terms of classic workflows, there was no good testing environment there. It was very cumbersome. The reality of it is, if you had a workflow that ran in the background, you also had to run it on an on-demand basis, and you had to recreate your records, and it was very painful. The Flow UI that Stephen's team has put together is very friendly for testing.
Yeah. And it's a great way. The things that are built for testing are a great way to teach others about Flow and walk them through, the execution, and showing them how things work natively. It takes away some of the stigma away, I think, in trying to teach others how to use Power Automate now.
Right. So, is there anything that you see any plans to update your white paper with the new announcements? Anything to prepare for RPA best practices or something?
I think I checked the bucket list in my life for doing white papers after this activity. If you ever want to talk to me about stretch goals, I'd be glad to tell you about what happens if you stretch a little too far. I'm not sure. There's nothing planned right now. To Stephen's point, there's a name change, but Flow is still, Flow's still there, and it's, Power Automate now has just a larger umbrella, and Flow is just a component of this larger business automation program. And to the extent I think the name change is great. And I think the way Flow is part of Power Automate is a pretty good system, the way it's been put together as a product.
Absolutely.
One quick question for you before we wrap. With enterprises, do you find now that you are ever in a situation where you have to build the flow based on the licensing, like per run, per user?
Right. So the guidance there is if you're building flows for the enterprise, you should not be building them where the actions are handled by real human being licenses. They should be using a service principal account license. And if I've got my license data correct, a service principal account would get 100,000 API calls in a 24-hour period. Stephen's shaking his head, which is great. I wouldn't have shown up for the podcast if I was going to get licensing questions.
I had to throw one in there.
Yeah.
Just one. That's the only one.
But I think, but even besides licensing, that would be the other important takeaway: is that these should be generic accounts that you're using. So if you're not using a service principal account, you need to use at least an account that's going to persist, that doesn't require a password change every 90 days, and it's tied to a real human being, and the human being leaves, because these are enterprise flows that need to go on forever and not be dependent upon a single person.
Right. And so that's really, if you have a citizen developer in an enterprise and they're building flows and one takes off, right, and people really like it, then you have to just take a look at that and maybe possibly refactor it to make sure it's can move on and can scale.
So I think the focus here is the principles in this document are for flows that run on behalf of the organization.
Right.
So then you get into the issue of personal productivity flows. So maybe there is a follow-on white paper about best practices for personal productivity flows. Thank you very much. Stephen just put that in the budget for next year. So, but that would be different. And when we do discuss some of the considerations in there and sharing flows and the rules and the security considerations in that, when you do that.
Excellent.
So go get the white paper. We'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Stephen. And thank you for listening to CRM Audio.